We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations.
With firearms right now and firearms owners, we have become the spearhead on a battle that's not about firearms. It's about trust in our government. It's about abuse of power. It's about ruling as opposed to governing.
We have a very respectful privilege, not a right, we have a privilege to own a firearm in this country.
If there was more of an awareness built around firearms, what they're capable of, and how to handle them, we'd be in a much different situation today.
The people that are supporting it are the people that don't know better. It's important to have the public educated on firearms just for the same reason as it is to be educated on riding a motorcycle or driving a car or a truck.
Today, it's about legally purchased firearms, but tomorrow it might be about something that you own or a right that you value. If you don't want to fight this on your own later for your own reasons, we would encourage Canadians to get involved in this case right now.
The CCFR is undertaking the largest, most expensive, most complete challenge to the firearms regulations and these bans that, to our knowledge, has ever existed.
You got something behind your eyes, the way you're talking, it's a cheap disguise. Said I'm gonna leave right before the red sun rises. Get free tonight and set it all on
Hi, I'm Jeff Coyle. I'm here at the Calgary Court Centre in Alberta. The show you're about to watch is a show called Broken Trust. That trust was broken on May 1st of 2020. For myself personally, I'm not coming to you as a gun owner. I'm coming to you as a concerned Canadian citizen, a father, a husband, that is concerned about the politics and what's happening here in Canada. I feel it's very important for every Canadian citizen to understand that this isn't about just being a gun owner. It's a story that's very convoluted, very complex. Every Canadian citizen should be concerned.
Okay, so Scott shoots first, but then you back him up, okay?
Our hometown hunt here, pretty cold. My face is cold, so I know theirs is. Besides being involved in television, I'm a hunter and an outdoorsman. I'm also a gun owner myself. And honestly, I had no reason to think that the type of firearms that I owned would be at risk from this ban.
We all know the Bucks haven't been kind to me this year.
So to be honest, I really didn't pay too much attention to it at first. The more you know about the story, the stranger it gets.
Stand by!
Canada has very strict gun laws, and they have been getting progressively stricter since the 70s. Our gun laws have been relatively stable since the early 1990s, with new laws coming in and being repealed, depending on what government was in power at the time. In the middle of all this, hunting remained an important part of Canadian culture, and target shooting exploded into an incredibly inclusive and accessible Canadian pastime. Stable and fair regulation was the key to allowing people to exercise their freedom to pursue their passions and at the same time pay close attention to public safety. But things were about to get turned upside down.
Nova Scotia RCMP say they have identified an active shooter in the rural community of Portapique. They're advising residents in the small community west.
Last week, 22 Canadians were killed in the deadliest rampage in our country's history.
Banning assault-style firearms will save Canadian lives. I'd like to take a moment, if I may, to speak to the law-abiding Canadian gun owners. I know from very many years of experience as a police officer that the overwhelming majority of gun owners in this country are law-abiding. They are responsible. They are conscientious.
After decades of target shooting and hunting being incredibly safe sports, we somehow ended up at this place, where the firearms that Canadians have used safely, they were now being labeled by the government as firearms designed to kill the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time. What changed?
Ready? The gun ban will have absolutely no effect on things like the tragedy in Nova Scotia. I'm Rod Giltaca. I'm the CEO and Executive Director for the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights.
Breaking news, though, for you. The federal government says a full public inquiry into the Nova Scotia mass killing that left 22 people dead in April will move forward after an outcry.
Our problem is not lack of laws. Our problem is mental health. Our problem in Nova Scotia was that the RCMP ignored this guy for years when people were actually moving out of the community, running away with all of their possessions to get away from this guy. The RCMP knew about him and they did nothing. So to use this to ban guns from people that have firearms licenses that are sport shooting or hunting is ludicrous.
Imagine instead a government in Ottawa that actually works for you. The NDP's New Deal for People.
Well, the fact that they did this with an OIC is interesting.
C'est nous. Parce que tout ça, c'est le Québec.
Between the Liberals and the Bloc, or the Liberals and the NDP, they have a majority government, and both of those parties will support gun control. So they could have done this properly using legislation, but there would have been debate and committees, and it would have had to make its way through the Senate, which sheds a lot of light on these bills.
This is a regulation. What that means is that it wasn't passed by Parliament. My name is Laura Warner and I'm a litigator with JSS Barristers in Calgary. It was passed by, it's called the Governor and Council. But most importantly, what that means is that instead of Parliament passing a law in the way that most Canadians would probably think of, laws getting passed through the legislative process, this was passed by Parliament asking somebody else to make something that has the effect of law, so a regulation.
They wanted to leverage the tragedy in Nova Scotia. In fact, they've gone out of their way to tell Canadians that it was the worst mass shooting in Canadian history, which it wasn't. The worst mass shooting that I'm aware of was at École Polytechnique.
The RCMP are really getting dragged under the bus and all this. I think some of that unfairly, but time will tell.
The tragedy in Nova Scotia wasn't a result of easy access to firearms. This individual smuggled all of his firearms.
Lors des dernières élections, nous nous sommes engagés à interdire les armes d'assaut de type militaire et à mettre en place un programme de rachat.
They were considering calling an election. They wanted to shore up some support with the gun control crowd. It's still a tragic event, don't get me wrong, but it's important that you are speaking in a truthful and accurate way, especially when you have control of the levers of government. Ironically, the only group, or if not the loudest group in Canada, that wants the government to work on root causes of crime, that work on the real problem, and it's a strange place for us to have found ourselves in, is the CCFR.
The CCFR is undertaking the largest, most expensive, most complete challenge to the firearms regulations and these bans that, to our knowledge, has ever existed. Sport shooting, for example, using an AR-15 is decades old in Canada, and there's been exactly 0 killings with a lawfully owned AR-15. My name is Mike Loberg. I'm an owner of Loberg Law, a litigator here in Calgary, Alberta. I'm qualified in 3 jurisdictions: Alberta, the Cayman Islands, United Kingdom, and Wales. I'm general counsel to the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, one of the founding directors of that organization as well. Together with Loberg Law, we are co-counsel with JSS Barristers in the litigation CCFR versus Canada. Most Canadians would say that there should be some regulations about firearms such that they don't get into the hands of violent felons or people who are suffering from dangerous mental disorders. But it certainly isn't any reason to justify doubling down and making more of the laws that you can't enforce. Making it more illegal, if I can use that term, is not a solution to any of these problems. So there's that. What we should be doing is finding ways to effectively enforce the laws that exist where they are proven, based upon evidence, to have some rational connection to the goal of the public. If there is no rational connection to public safety, for example, with a 20 mm bore diameter, I can't imagine why they thought that would be dangerous. I can't imagine what they were seeking to do there. But they banned that, and they're going to spend money enforcing that. It will serve absolutely no purpose. Same thing with banning the high-powered hunting rifles, which, to my knowledge, have not been used in any crime ever. I mean, these things are very expensive pieces of kit. My primary concern with what the government is doing is that they keep trying the same thing over and over again. It's the definition of insanity. The amount of money that's been spent on long gun registries, firearm bans, firearm regulations is obscene. And all of that money should have been used to prevent crime, to interdict illegal transmission of guns across the US border, and to keep kids from getting involved in crime and gang activity. We're going to see a great number of challenges. However, we're going to meet them. We're going to have this thing adjudicated in the federal court fully and completely. I expect that we are going to get some opposition along the path, but we'll achieve our goals, at very least of having a reasonable and fair hearing and holding the government to account in a forum where they can't play cute as they do in question period and just give a non-answer. This time they're going to have to give real answers. They're going to actually show us the evidence that they based this legislation on, if indeed there is any.
We are in the midst of a historic gun ban, and our position is this equates to a massive confiscation of property from hundreds of thousands of people who legally acquired it, so that's a problem. And the people that acquired this property are RCMP vetted licensed gun owners who are inherently responsible.
So this is where we are. History is about to be made in the building that's right behind us. Now, I know for some of you, you're watching the show and you may not be a gun owner. For some of you, you may have guns and they might not be affected by the gun ban. But I encourage you as a Canadian, the way this was done was not right. And that doesn't mean that they won't do it again where it could affect you as a Canadian.
Hey, let's go. A little bit hot. You're hot too.
Today, we are closing the market for military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada.
The uphill battle that gun owners are facing in this situation is the fact that they have a government that is putting a lot of effort into misleading mainstream Canadians about what really happened and about how it could have been prevented. It was done through an order in council, which is a legal instrument that was never meant to be used for mass confiscation of property. The big problem with using the order in council is the limited options for gun owners to fight back. With an election possible in the near future, the firearms community, led by the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, exercises the only option available: take the federal government to court.
Order in council, which means this didn't go to the floor of our House of Commons to be discussed with the opposition. This was a decree that was ordained behind closed doors, just the cabinet. Hi, I'm Jim Shockey, and I'm a naturalist who also happens to be a firearms owner. The recent ban includes guns that are not designed to kill the, and I quote, maximum number of people in the shortest amount of time. They're guns that are hunting firearms. I have one that's a double barrel English rifle, a Turkish walnut, and it's engraved. It was 100% designed for hunting, has never been used in any military application, and I would argue has never been used to kill any person in the world ever. It's been around for 100 years, that caliber. I've got another bolt action rifle, 460 Weatherby. I've used it many, many times around the world, and it's now a banned firearm because it's a firearm that hunters would never use, and that's meant to kill the maximum number of people in the shortest amount of time. It's not the truth.
Our courts have come along and said, look, when things that have the effect of law are passed in this way, they have to withstand a review by the courts for whether or not they're basically, are they reasonable? Are they coherent? Are they internally coherent? Is there a certain logic to them? And so here, when you compare the regulation against here's what the government said it was intended to do, here's what the evidence shows it's actually going to do, when you hold it up to those kinds of tests, there's good reason to believe that the regulation might not pass muster. Probably the main thing that's jumped out at me has been the extent to which on the ground, the way that the regulation of firearms in Canada is actually carried out is surprisingly unpredictable and disjointed.
If we really want to be successful, we have to look at addressing the criminal use of firearms, not the existence of firearms. When I see the chiefs of police and the general officer in the street scratching their heads and not really completely understanding this, there needs to be some sort of challenge. And if it means a legal challenge in the courts and look at the facts and have a judge weigh what's really going on, then so be it. My name's Pete Merrifield. I'm a vice president with the National Police Federation, representing over 20,000 Canadian police officers. Regulating and further banning a licensed and legal gun owner is not the proper use of what could be between $300 million and $1 billion is estimated by a variety of different political parties.
But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer.
Besides the vote grab, the Prime Minister's talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's saying, as Indigenous hunters who are sustenance hunting, we can use one of those 1,500 banned rifles to hunt. The contradiction is he's already said Canadians don't need these 1,500 types of rifles, shotguns, because there's no purpose for them. But yet over here, he clearly says, oh, okay, we will allow this amnesty period for those who own one of these 1,500 firearms. We will allow them to continue to use that for sustenance hunting. My name is Stephen Glode. I am a 27-year retired member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I am also a firearms owner who happens to be Indigenous. But he'll try every avenue to keep the fight with the CCFR out of court, because he's going to lose. Canadians need to understand that you cannot buy military-grade assault rifles in this country. You buy a black rifle that might look mean, however you want to write the definition of mean, but you cannot buy military-grade assault weapons in this country. I'm a father of 4. Believe me, if it was going to keep Canadians safe, I'd be behind it 150%, because not only that, it was my life that was on the line and my friends' lives every time we went out the door.
The application at the highest level is taking a run at the legality of the regulation. One of the big issues is that there's a specific set of rules around how the person who gets given that power by Parliament needs to exercise it. If somebody else tells you you can do X, then you have to stay within the 4 corners of X. And so one way of looking at it is, does this regulation fit within what Parliament said the Governor and Council was allowed to do? And so another really important thing that we're asking the court to look at is that relationship between you've got Parliament giving some power to the Governor and Council, and then in kind of an informal way, you've got the RCMP taking some really important steps under the regulation. And I say really important because some of what's happening is that firearms that aren't specifically listed in the regulation are being designated by the RCMP as sort of being caught up in this new prohibition. And whether or not it's proper for the RCMP to be doing that is an important question in the application.
The federal government's list of banned firearms is growing, and it's catching gun owners and even sellers by surprise.
Back in 2014, the Conservative government took away the power from the RCMP to classify firearms. They did this because the RCMP classified a few firearms as prohibited without telling anyone. They decided this decision was better left to Parliament. Here we go, a few short years later, the Liberal government takes over. They decide to give this responsibility back to the RCMP and to have them make the decisions on the classification of firearms. And now we have this giant mess.
This gun ban is not going to make our country more safe. In fact, it's going to lead to anxiety to people that aren't educated on firearms.
Yeah, it's wild. And he told us
Criminals are still going to be criminals. It's not about the firearms. It's about the crime, like 100%. I am Amanda Lynn Mayhew, and I am a mentor in the firearms and outdoors industry. Okay, so you're gonna pick this gun up and shoulder it first, and we're gonna check. I don't want to go out and buy a new gun right now because I don't know if that's gonna end up on the list. The list of the guns affects a lot of the firearms that we used at range days. The not knowing of which firearms we can use and the availability, you know, just the whole ordeal. From the elderly to the young and new. Everyone has something on there, and it is so vague, and it's hard to understand. You don't get where are they coming from? Where are they picking these out of, and why?
Look at you!
We did take the registration numbers for 3 range day events, and right now we've postponed them to 2021. We don't want to educate new shooters coming into the industry on something that could be banned. It's the first time in 11 years that I haven't seen a group of 30 women, you know, learning about firearms, and that kind of hurts.
They've left you no avenue other than court to object to this type of behavior. You can be inadvertently breaking the law as a gun owner. If you pick up your rifle this fall to go out for deer season and you didn't know that it's been added to the FRT, which the public has no access to, that carries a mandatory minimum of 2 years in prison. My name is Tracy Wilson, and I am Vice President of Public Relations for the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights.
And so
I own AR-15s and a variety of other non-restricted semi-autos.
The AR-15 and many other weapons were designed for military use. They were designed for soldiers to kill other soldiers.
Well, the AR-15 was actually a hunting rifle that was adopted by the U.S. Army in the middle 50s.
It's a U.S. Army rifle, and it's a very efficient weapon for killing people. Mass murderers know that, too.
Any firearm is in the wrong hands, Bill.
This is the thing, right? Well, so is a bolt action at distance, right?
Well,
like the Parliament Hill shooter.
I'm talking about killing a lot of people.
The Parliament Hill shooter was a lever action, and he got right into the library, Bill.
And didn't kill 25 people, like was done at Sandy Hook, and didn't kill 50 people, like was
we
done
don't
at
have
Christchurch.
full auto.
This is this isn't the United States.
And again, we have absolutely no intention to add any new impediments or bureaucratic measures for those hunters and farmers. And so to suggest that somehow we're targeting them and their weapons is false.
So typically an OIC or an ordering council is used to implement the measures within a bigger piece of legislation. However, this time they've used an OIC to do something so broad, so sweeping, that in my opinion, it's an abuse of power, especially during a global pandemic when the Parliament is not sitting, the government has been suspended, and while people are locked up in their homes, unable to speak out for themselves, even unable to have their members of Parliament bring their voices to the debate. So to me, that's a huge problem.
I want to take a moment to recognize the leadership of Minister Blair on this file. Tackling gun violence has been a personal and professional priority of his for decades. He's done incredible work to make this policy a reality, and we are here today thanks to his leadership and to the leadership of people like him.
I don't think the Minister of Public Safety is interested in any conversation that helps Canadians, because on one hand, he's doing these big gun grabs.
We will introduce legislation at the first opportunity to fulfill our commitments to Canadians, to keep guns out of the hands of criminals.
On the other hand, there's all kinds of things that are left unaddressed, like that Guns and Gangs initiative with the money.
Alan, with the spat of violence we've seen this past week, especially this past weekend, that has a lot of people saying that this money is long overdue and much needed.
To help stop these shootings in downtown Toronto and downtown Vancouver, they haven't even given the money out after 5 years. It seems like they could care less with solving problems, but they are hyper-focused on taking guns from people that have firearms licenses.
You know, many people arrive in Ottawa and they become blinded to why they wanted to go there in the first place. Glenn Motz, Member of Parliament for Medicine, Cards and Warner. I'm the Associate Shadow Minister for Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. They may lose themselves there. And I think this is an example of someone who, to use the expression, drank the Kool-Aid of an ideology from individuals who believe that banning guns at all costs, and there's the anti-gun lobby out there that's very, very strong and has the ear of government and certain officials in government that are saying that, well, this is going to cure all of our woes for public safety. Well, I think that's naive, and I think, unfortunately, Bill, Minister Blair, has I think abandoned some of the things from his background that would help in this conversation to actually make a difference for public safety. I'm sure he feels it, but he's probably pressured from his own cabinet to, toe the party line. This is extremely lazy government. Rather than going after what we know to be the problem, illegally smuggled firearms, gangs, the use of firearms in the commission of offenses from people who are not licensed to have possession of them. That's the problem here. It's not the millions of Canadians who own firearms. They are 2 to 3 times less likely to commit a criminal offense, a violent criminal offense, than any other Canadian.
Fixing the problem is not about banning a type of gun. Fixing things is a large and complex problem. Why are people being murdered? Well, let's look at the cuts to mental health treatments in our healthcare system, addiction problems and dependency problems. Let's look at what's failing in our correctional system when it comes to actually correcting people. The element here is that as law enforcement professionals, we realize that if you don't deal with the criminal, you're not dealing with the problem. 54% of all homicides in this country are committed by stabbing, beating, or strangulation. Only 38% are committed by firearm. So the motivation for a particular type at this point is not really resonating or making sense because it's not at the forefront of what has been the problem. I can cite a number of homicides in the last 15 years that were all committed with standard hunting type of firearms, long guns, rifles, shotguns, bolt action, lever action. If there was some sort of a direct problem that was being addressed, it would make sense from an enforcement perspective. I really can't speak to the motivation on it. I think, again, we have to go back and focus on the crime problem because we don't have a gun problem. It's important that the public recognize we share the longest undefended border in the world next door to the world's largest manufacturer of small arms. We have a free flow border of commerce and travel because of our shared mutual interests, having occupied the continent together now for more than 400 years. If we want to control criminal gun activity, we have to focus on things like criminal smuggling, criminal use. We have to rely upon a system of legislation and criminal punishment that goes after those that commit crimes, those that murder people. The frustration that I think most law enforcement officers face is that we have become the janitors in society. You know, every time a policy fails, we get sent in to clean it up.
I think if everyday Canadians spent a little bit of time understanding the firearm issue, they'd see that the mass banning or seizing of firearms is not justified by evidence, yet the government is moving forward and doing that anyway. I think most people are concerned. They're thinking, well, if they can do that to gun owners without justification, what can they actually do to me?
When I started building Broken Trust, I had no clue of how convoluted and how confusing this whole process would be. The one thing that I do know and have come to realize is that having children, they can't stand up and fight for themselves. For me, it's become more important than ever to get this message out there and help people understand what's happening. I'm not going to sit here and whine as a gun owner. I've always been and always will be someone who's law-abiding and will follow the rules that are set forth for me. I have a right to go hunting, and my hope is that I can take my children with me someday and have them teach their children how to hunt as well.
So, effective immediately, it is no longer permitted to buy, sell, transport, import, or use military-grade assault weapons in this country.
Well, the news broke before the actual day. I'm Brad Moniziak. I am a firearms owner, a field officer for the CCFR, and a concerned citizen. So many Canadians don't realize what it takes to get a firearms license in Canada. Canadian firearms owners are law-abiding. They want to follow the laws, but the government, through poor wording, has made it almost impossible for us to do that. Right? When it first dropped, there was so much room for interpretation that it wasn't clear, and still isn't legally, whether certain types of firearms are legal or not. The RCMP, through the firearms reference table, has gone through every firearm that's allowed in Canada. They have made multiple updates over the past few months, arbitrarily deciding that one day this firearm doesn't meet the criteria of being banned, the next day it does. AR-15 variant, there's examples in the firearms reference table, which Canadian firearms owners don't have access to in real time. There's examples where previously certain firearms were classified definitely not an AR-15 variant. And now the RCMP is saying it is. And the reason they're reclassifying is strictly on looks. There's no functionality that's the same as the AR-15. I think a lot of Canadian firearms owners knew that something like this would be happening once the Liberals were elected. They ran on a platform of firearms reform, I'll say.
We've paid out over $102 million, and once again I expect that number to rise as we complete the process that we've commenced.
They were assault rifles and they were purchased legally on an A category gun licence, the standard licence held by gun owners in New Zealand.
With New Zealand having used the OIC, I think a lot of people had a fear that something similar would happen in Canada.
In New Zealand, where they did a buyback program, they had less than 20% of people voluntarily comply. And you know, I suspect in Canada that number might become even lower. We've talked to many consumers that are unwilling to give up their property. They don't want any part of losing their property. So now you have a situation where down the road, these owners might be in illegal possession of these items. Again, it's a very large undertaking for law enforcement. I don't think this is something that any law enforcement is looking for. We don't need our law enforcement having conflicts with law-abiding gun owners about their property. The undertaking, I think, has been minimized by the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, and it has not been lost on law enforcement. We've talked to them, and they're very fearful of the costs and the amount of hours of administration is going to take.
Canada maintains one of the best systems globally of registration, training, licensing, and responsibility for firearms owners. I've traveled to New Zealand as a law enforcement officer. It's an island in the middle of the ocean. Controlling their borders is a far easier task than Canada.
You will find the majority of frontline police officers will say this 1,500 firearms ban will do nothing to deter crime. If we all go back to the original gun registration by the Liberals, which was a complete and utter failure, but yet it was supposed to be a system to create safe means and make a safer Canada, and they would register all the firearms. That was a complete failure, and we knew it from day one. But the sad fact is, again, people in positions of authority who are able to make changes wouldn't do it back then. And therefore, we cost Canadians billions of dollars. And it was another thing taxed to the RCMP to deliver, to take charge of, to look after on an already stretched federal police force.
The gun ban does not consider the consequences to individuals and businesses whose livelihood depends on the responsible gun ownership and who support the firearms industry in Canada. This is an industry that has a vested interest in helping Canadians become comfortable with ownership, knowledge, and use of various types of firearms. By far, Canadians have supported gun control measures and have harmoniously abided by the rules. Gun owners in Canada understand that safety, personal as well as public safety, is priority number one. It is in a gun owner's best interest to follow the rules, store firearms safely, and portray responsible gun ownership to the general public. It is also in the best interest of Canadians to be aware, not be willfully ignorant, and stop the erosion of firearm rights. The Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, CCFR, is an organization with the responsibility to raise awareness for gun owners as well as the public about these rights.
Training, there's background checks that are all in place by the Canadian Firearms Program, which is overseen by the RCMP. That's their job to make sure that program works. Hi, I'm Matt Hipwell with Wolverine Supplies here in Virden, Manitoba. I'm a second-generation owner of our family-owned business. We share the largest undefended border in the world, and we have a problem with smuggled firearms into our country. To my knowledge, there has been little, if no consultation from industry directly. Where we have had contact are from our local elected member of parliaments in various regions of the country, where our member of parliaments have asked some of these questions and asked, what has the government done, or where are we at as far as how to interpret the OIC as introduced. You ride a motorcycle. 7 signatures, they could ban every motorcycle in Canada. Do they need to give you a reason? Well, they didn't with the firearms. They're saying that it was evidence-based. We haven't seen it. Motorcycles, maybe they're going to say, well, they have 2 wheels, they don't serve a practical purpose, and people are more likely to die on a motorcycle than they are on a vehicle with 4 wheels. They haven't provided the evidence to consult with industry on the best way that maybe we should have implemented regulations. They've said that this number of items are can be exported. Well, maybe before the federal government said we could export them, they should have checked what countries they can be exported to. A lot of people think you can return it to the manufacturer. It is not that simple. Some of these products, once exported, cannot be re-imported into the country they originated from. The RCMP and the federal government, and when we say RCMP here, we're talking about the Canadian Firearms Program. Are they misinformed? Yes, there's some misinformation there. There's a lot of information out there that they go to the advocacy groups and everything else. Where did these advocacy groups get their knowledge and expertise on firearms? I feel strongly that the firearms industry has been overlooked in this area and hasn't had the ability to pass on information, be part of a consultative process in order to meet the needs of the firearms industry.
Recent polls suggest Canadians are in support of the ban. This is incredibly misleading.
A recent Ipsos poll for Global News shows 52% of urban Canadians believe all guns should be made illegal in this country. The results may have been different if rural areas were also surveyed.
Most likely, this reflects a high percentage of the public who do not know anything about firearm classifications or what the Canadian laws are. That's why terms like assault-style weapons work. They sound bad to uninformed citizens, but mean nothing. Inevitably, the public will be influenced by stereotypical information and conversations about firearm rights in the US. Even if 10% of those in favor of the gun ban knew anything about firearms, their classification, or the laws in Canada, that still leaves way too many Canadians supporting the gun ban without knowing anything about it.
One of the things that the CCFR, the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, was created to do is to provide public education about firearms in Canada. Safe sport shooting and hunting, the activities that have been going on since Canada was formed and have been going on to this very date. Canadians may very well look at the American television, which is very often a problem. That bears no resemblance to reality. That is not why I own a pistol. I am a sport shooter. I like to do target shooting. It bears no resemblance to it, but the average Canadian sees these things on television, and they are also fed through mainstream media and various anti-gun organizations the image of more guns equals more death. And that's demonstrably untrue, right? More criminals equals more crime and more death. That is demonstrably true. The one thing that needs to be done is we need to focus on crime and leave law-abiding gun owners alone.
You know, you can bet when you're in a competition, you have a loaded gun on your hip. You're taking on a great degree of responsibility.
Stand by. Time, 1.79.
Every Canadian should be concerned with how this ban is being put in place and how it affects property owners. The government is using its authority to vilify a specific group without consideration of the consequences. This treats citizens differently and will inevitably lead to an undesirable outcome. The fight is actually a battle for good governance, a healthy democracy, and basic rights to own property. Gun owners are on the front lines. Gun owners may very well be an unlikely ally of every Canadian. So here we are. This fight is as much mine as it is yours and everyone else's. The current government has opened the door for future political parties to use an order in council to push through politics of the day. As Canadians, we all understand that owning a firearm is a privilege in this country. It's not much different than owning a vehicle or driving. It's a privilege that we highly value. The current gun ban may or may not affect you. Let's protect our future and our children's future. You need to be involved in the conversation. Go to the CCFR's website and join today.
You got something behind your eyes.